All right, guys, the goal of this video is to go through an introduction to the cardiovascular system, and we're going to start off by focusing on the heart. Blood vessels will come in later videos because I think it makes sense to talk about the heart as a generator of pressure first. And that's probably the most important thing to remember in all of this is your heart's just a pump. The only thing that it's really capable of doing is contracting and generating pressure, right? And if you remember throughout this entire system, a very simple rule is that blood always, without exception, flows from high to low pressure, right? So there are no exceptions to that, right? We can use valves to prevent backflow. We can use blood vessels to constrict and dilate, to shunt blood to different locations. You can make all these adjustments, but at the end of the day, always high to low pressure, and there's never an exception to that, right? So the goal of the heart is create that pressure and push the blood in the direction that we want it to go. And one of the first things you'll notice is the cardiovascular system is split into two separate circuits. The first of them that we call the systemic circuit is blood that's being pumped from the left side of the heart that's going out the aorta. And the right side of the heart, right, this is the right ventricle, is pumping entirely to the lungs through the pulmonary circuit, right? So in this illustration, it's obviously not anatomically accurate, but this is showing you the pulmonary circuit. This would be the capillaries to the left and right lungs. And then all of this and this are supposed to represent the capillaries of the systemic circuit. And systemic circuit is every organ that's not a lung. So you've got blood going up to the brain, to the muscles of the face, muscles throughout the entire body, kidney, stomach, liver, everything. Anything that isn't the lung gets its blood from the left ventricle in the aorta. And so the question is, why do we have to do it that way? And the simple answer at first seems to be, well, we've got different goals here, right? In the lungs, we're adding oxygen to the blood and we're removing CO2. In the systemic circuit, we're doing the opposite. We're releasing oxygen out for these tissues to use, and those tissues are producing CO2 and putting it back into the blood. That's the reason we have two sets of capillary beds, right? So the lungs, their capillaries are entirely geared towards bring in oxygen, pump out CO2. The systemic capillaries, the opposite, deliver oxygen and release it to those tissues, and then take the CO2 waste that they produce and carry it back to the lungs to get rid of it, right? That's a separate issue, though, to ask, why do we have to have two separate sides of the heart? Why can't we just put it all in one big loop with one heart chamber to do the job? And the answer is anytime blood goes through a capillary bed, because capillaries are so incredibly small, is they lose pressure. It'd be kind of like if you routed a fire hose through a bunch of drinking straws and then brought it back together into another fire hose, the pressure would be gone. Small vessels like that have a really high resistance to blood flow. They sap pressure. And so down here, when we're coming back the vena cava, right, out of the systemic circuit, you could imagine saying, oh, just send the vena cava straight to the lungs and we can exchange oxygen and CO2 that way. The problem is those veins have incredibly low pressure because they just came out of that capillary bed. And so we have to go back to the right side of the heart, pressurize again so that we have enough force to push the blood through the lungs. Okay. So again, it's all about pressure, all about high to low. And if you keep track of that, the rest of this will make a lot more sense. All right. Okay. Now that we've got that out of the way, the thing that I want to focus on next is the path of blood flow to the heart, and that'll be a lead into the sequence of events in the heart. And I can't reinforce enough, those are two different things. Path of blood flow is like, imagine that you had a GPS on a car and you were watching on a map as it traveled around the city. Path of blood flow is like that, but for a red blood cell, right? You can start wherever you want because it's a circulatory system. You're going to loop back around eventually. And so if just arbitrarily we start in the right atrium, right? The right atrium is getting its blood from the superior vena cava that drains blood from everything above the heart in the systemic circuit, and the inferior vena cava that drains blood from everything below the heart in the systemic circuit. So all of that venous blood drains back to the right atrium, which then flows into the right ventricle. And when the ventricle contracts, we push that blood up the structure that we call the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk very quickly splits into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Those are just going to the left and right lungs. All right, now you'll notice it seems weird. You typically think of veins as being blue and arteries as being red. The pulmonary arteries are blue because they're deoxygenated, right? And so artery and vein don't mean oxygen or not. An artery is any blood vessel carrying blood away from the heart, and a vein is any blood vessel that's carrying blood back toward the heart. So these are pulmonary arteries, even though they're deoxygenated because they're going to go to the lungs, right? That is their destination. And then from the lungs, we're going to bring that now oxygenated blood back to the pulmonary veins, right? So pulmonary veins are carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the left ventricle. Left ventricle pushes its blood, left atrium, pushes its blood into the left ventricle. And when the ventricle squeezes, now we're going up and out the aorta, right? That aorta is carrying blood to all of your systemic organs, right? Anything that's not a lung, right? And the blood from the systemic circuit is just going to loop back around to the vena cava, right? And we're right back where we started, right? Now, that's the path of blood flow. That is not the sequence of events. So if path of blood flow is like tracing a car on a map with GPS, the sequence of events in the heart is more like, what's the order of events in the engine cycling inside the car, of like the cylinders moving and the spark plugs firing and the fuel combusting. That's a different question. The order of events is simplified. We'll get to details later, that both atria contract first, right? So the right atrium and the left atrium both contract at the same time, and they push their blood into the ventricle, right? The whole job of the atrium is just to make sure that the ventricle is swelled full of a lot of blood. So it's kind of like a primer. We're priming the pump, filling the ventricles full of blood. Okay, so atria both contract. Then once the ventricles are full of blood, they will contract, right, and push blood up and out the pulmonary trunk if we're on the right side, and up and out the aorta if we're on the left side. Right, now, the next question is, where do all these valves come in? Remember, valves only have one function. They make sure that blood flows one way, which means they're preventing backflow. Okay? So we know now that when this right ventricle contracts, we know that we really need blood to go this way, up and out the pulmonary trunk. We absolutely do not want it to go this way, back into the atrium, right? So intuitively, it makes sense. When the ventricle contracts, the force of the contraction closes this tricuspid valve and opens this pulmonary valve, right? The reason for that is it's just pressure. Just like blood flows from high to low pressure, pressure pushes the valves closed. It's kind of like if your doors are open in your house on a breezy day and the wind rushes through, it'll slam the door shut. It's just air pressure, right? And so these are one-way valves, kind of like a door. They only open one direction. And so the tricuspid valve only opens into the ventricle this way, and the pulmonary valve, that's this guy, only opens up into the pulmonary trunk. If blood tries to go the wrong direction, then the valves are going to close. Okay, so when the ventricle contracts, you expect this tricuspid valve to close, this valve to open. When the ventricle relaxes, now the pulmonary valve closes to block blood from coming back down in the ventricle from the pulmonary trunk, which would be flowing in reverse. And the tricuspid will open to let the ventricle refill, right? And the same exact thing works on the left side. This time, the mitral valve, which these valves have multiple names. Mitral is also called bicuspid. Annoyingly, this is also sometimes called the left AV valve, and the tricuspid is sometimes called the right AV valve. AV just stands for atrioventricular because the valves are separating the atrium and the ventricle. Right. All right, so we've got our basic heart cycle. We've got our valves preventing backflow, right? Mitral prevents backflow into the atrium, just like the aortic valve that's kind of hiding under here prevents backflow from the aorta. All right, and this picture, I think, shows it really well. So this is looking at a cross-section of the heart. So we basically cut the atria off and we're looking down into the heart from like an aerial view from top down. This is showing what it looks like when the tricuspid and the mitral are closed. They sort of open like flaps of a parachute, right, and prevent blood from going the wrong direction. But the aortic and the pulmonary valves are open now. Valves are pushed to the side, so blood would be coming up and out of those vessels right now past the open valves, right? And this is what we would expect to see when the ventricles are contracting. So the ventricles contract, tricuspid and mitral are closed, so we don't backflow into the atria, and aortic and pulmonaries are open so that we get blood flowing out like we need to. Right? This view is showing what you would expect with the ventricles relaxed. Right? Now, tricuspid and mitral are open because we want blood to flow through the atrium into the ventricles. That's how the ventricles refill when they're relaxing. And now the aortic and pulmonary are closed because we don't want blood backflowing in reverse from the aorta or the pulmonary trunk back into the ventricles, because that would just be the blood going right back where it came from, and then we've wasted all our effort pumping it in the first place. Right. Now, if these valves don't close properly, prolapse and stenotic, prolapse means the valve pushes too far into the chamber that it's being pushed into, and prolapse or stenotic means that it's not pushed far enough in. It'd be kind of like a door not clicking in place at the door jamb. You're going to let blood backflow. So if you get a prolapsed or stenotic valve, it just means that it's not closing perfectly, and a little bit of blood is going to squeak through and go the wrong direction. That just puts extra strain on the heart because the heart's become inefficient. It's pumping some of its blood in the wrong direction, and so it's going to have to work harder to get whatever percentage is going in the right direction pushed out there. Right. Okay, so the last part of my introduction it's a little complicated and it's a little physicsy, but I think it's worth it. And so the idea is we want to talk about the relationship between volume and pressure. And I split this into two different ideas. The first is thinking about the volume, I say the volume of a container. And so by a container, I mean like a heart chamber. So when a heart chamber, like a ventricle or an atrium contracts, the ventricle or atrium is squeezing. It's made of muscle, right? And so when you squeeze a muscle, the muscle's trying to get smaller. That means that the volume of the container is decreasing, it's shrinking, right? And so imagine like in your hands holding a water balloon that had an opening on the top. If you squeeze it hard, the water is going to shoot out, right? You are shrinking the volume of the balloon, and that's increasing the pressure, right? And the result is the water shoots out. So the same thing happens in the heart. When the ventricle squeezes and contracts, the volume is going down, which makes the pressure shoot up. And since you know blood always moves from high to low, you expect the blood to be ejected wherever it can escape. We're hoping for the ventricles up and out the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. Right. That is different than the idea of fluid volume, right? This is the idea that if fluid volume decreases, that would be like poking a hole in the balloon and letting some water leak out, right? That is going to make pressure go down. So in the heart, that would be like, when blood leaves and escapes to the aorta, that's what's letting your pressure go back down so that you don't stay elevated forever, right? Or if a person loses blood, like imagine you are bleeding and your blood volume goes down, that is going to start dropping your blood pressure because, right, you're leaking volume. And so pay very careful attention. If you're talking about a container volume, like an atrium or a ventricle, then decreasing volume means increasing pressure. If you're talking about fluid volume, like letting blood enter or exit, then decreasing volume decreases pressure. And paying attention to those two like differentiators will make things a lot less complicated when we move on to more advanced stuff. Okay. All right, so this is video 1. Follow along on the playlist so you get all these in order. In the next video, we're going to talk about heart rhythm, the SA node, pacemaker potentials, and how we regulate heart rate and rhythm.